Evolution has shaped every decision we make, but here's the wild part. Our brains are still running on software that's 10,000 years old. Today we're exploring how ancient instincts are secretly controlling our modern choices.
That's fascinating because recent neuroscience research shows that 95% of our decisions happen in our subconscious mind before we're even aware of them.
You know what's even more mind-blowing? Those split-second decisions that kept our ancestors alive, like detecting threats and shadows, are the same neural pathways that trigger us to panic buy during market downturns.
Mm. That explains why even sophisticated investors often make emotional trading decisions, despite knowing better.
Exactly right. And we're seeing this play out in corporate settings too. Studies show that 67% of executives admit to making major strategic decisions based on gut instinct rather than data.
Well, that certainly explains some of the tech bubble bursts we've witnessed. But how do modern organizations overcome these primitive instincts?
That's where systems thinking comes in. Companies like Toyota have revolutionized their decision-making by implementing what they call slow thinking protocols, requiring multiple perspectives and cooling off periods before major decisions.
Oh, interesting. Like how Amazon requires executives to write 6-page memos before making significant changes.
Exactly. And the results are impressive. Organizations that implement systematic decision-making processes show a 23% improvement in strategic outcomes compared to those relying on traditional methods.
This reminds me of how artificial intelligence is being used to help overcome these biological limitations.
Right. Well, McKinsey actually published a fascinating study on this. They found that AI-augmented decision-making reduced emotional bias by up to 31% in investment choices.
That's remarkable. Though I imagine there's still resistance to letting machines help with these deeply human processes.
Well, here's what's interesting about that. Research shows that teams using hybrid human-AI decision systems outperform both pure human and pure AI approaches by about 40%.
So it's not about replacing our ancient instincts, but rather understanding and complementing them with modern tools.
Precisely. And some companies are getting really creative with this, like Google's famous 10x thinking approach, which deliberately short-circuits our tendency for incremental improvements.
Though I imagine implementing these changes isn't easy when you're fighting against millennia of evolutionary programming.
You're right about that. The data shows that roughly 70% of organizational change initiatives fail, largely because they don't account for these deeply ingrained behavioral patterns.
So what's the solution? How do successful organizations manage this transition?
Well, the most effective approach seems to be what's called the triple loop learning model. First, you acknowledge the primitive response, then analyze the pattern, and finally create new systems that work with, not against, these natural tendencies.
That sounds similar to how high-frequency trading firms design their algorithms to capitalize on, rather than fight against market psychology.
Exactly that. And speaking of market psychology, a recent study from MIT showed that markets following major crashes exhibit almost identical pattern recognition to prehistoric threat response patterns.
Well, that certainly puts a new perspective on the phrase bear market.
And here's what's really fascinating. Companies that understand these patterns and plan for them show 42% better crisis resilience than their peers.
Though I suppose the challenge is maintaining that systematic thinking when everything around you is in crisis mode.
That's why the most successful organizations are now investing heavily in what's called cognitive infrastructure. Systems and protocols designed specifically to override our cave person instincts when needed.
So in essence, we're using technology to protect us from ourselves.
In a way, yes. But it's more about enhancement than protection. The future belongs to organizations that can balance our primitive strengths, like intuition and pattern recognition, with modern analytical capabilities.
That's quite a paradigm shift from the traditional view of human versus machine.
And that's exactly why we're seeing this explosion in adaptive AI systems that are designed to complement rather than replace human decision-making. The numbers are pretty striking. Companies using these hybrid approaches are seeing productivity gains of up to 35%.
So maybe the real question isn't whether we can overcome our cave person instincts, but how we can best work with them in the modern world.
That's exactly right. And as we wrap up today's show, remember, understanding our evolutionary heritage isn't about fighting against it. It's about building better systems that help us make wiser choices in a world our ancestors could never have imagined.